Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. This episode was recorded in our Wednesday evening class featuring our longtime member and chaplain, Lou Parker. We hope you enjoy this message.
Okay, so lesson 7, I think is going to be our last lesson on Solomon, and talking about the downfall of King Solomon. Most of the time we think of King Solomon as being a really good guy, and people are complicated. Don't you know that? People are complicated, complex. There's good and there's bad. It's a mixture for all of us. Our life experiences, where we grew up, the jobs that we've held, who our mother and father were. All has to do with our complexity as a person. And the amazing thing to me is God uses us, knowing that we are imperfect people. That's the most amazing thing to me, that God uses us, even though that He knows from the outset that we're not going to be the best. And that, when we yield ourselves to Him, He makes up the difference. But then there are times when we just willingly sin. And I am guilty of that, but again, it's just amazing what God does. I don't understand this. The only thing that I've come to the conclusion about with all this is that God is much more concerned with our character than He is with our career. Yeah. He doesn't care about how rich or poor we are. He doesn't care what kind of car we drive or what kind of house we live in. He is not impressed with any of that stuff. But what He is impressed with is how much that we let Him shape us, how much that we allow Him to make us into His image. Because like the old TV commercial says, pay me now or pay me later, well, pay me now or pay me later, you will be made into the image of the Lord, either here on earth or in heaven, but it's going to happen. And I want to kind of also mention this too as a thought about the complexity of people and the complexity of Solomon. When you are a leader, there's two very important things that you have to contend with as an effective leader, okay? And you have at one point in your life some rank, okay? That you have the authority to do something, okay? Whether or not you're the head of the house, okay? Whether or not you're in the military, whether or not you're a policeman, whether or not you're a congressman. There's some kind of authority that you have in the position that you have, okay? But there's a flip side to that. Yes, you have maybe some kind of constitutional right for something, okay? And President Trump has some constitutional authority, which is like unquestioned. But the flip side of that is that you need some moral authority. We would say credibility. And that's where a lot of leaders fail, okay? That's why we don't follow certain leaders, because they fail morally or they don't have the credibility that we think we need to have. When I was in the Army, okay, and I'm sure Jim would tell you, same thing in the Marine Corps, when Mike was in, the Army as a sergeant, the last thing you wanted to do to get somebody to do something was pull rank on them. Amen. That was the last thing. Now, there were times when you had to do that because you got some ornery person that just wasn't going to do it. Debbie Bernstein. Okay? Don't worry about that, Pam. Don't worry about that. What you wanted to do was to get somebody to follow you or do something because you had credibility. They didn't have to do that. you didn't have to pull rank on them. They just knew that naturally you had some credibility, or we would say moral authority to get something done.
A lot of leadership.
Yeah, I mean that's part of leadership. That's right. Well, one of the things that we see here, and we're going to talk about a little bit, is that Solomon began to lack that credibility, that leadership skill. And we all need to remember that that's one of the big parts, of getting things done. When you're trying to get something done, your kids something done, that you want them to do stuff because they know it's the right thing to do, not because you have to yell at them to get it done, So I dusted off this old quote down here that you've all heard before, but I want to kind of put it a little bit in context, okay? Lord Acton writes to Bishop Creighton in 1887 in England. Historic responsibility has to make up for the want of legal responsibility. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Have y'all heard that one before? Yeah. Great men are always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more, when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. There is no worse heresy than the office sanctifies the holder of it. That is the point at which the negation of Catholicism and the negation of liberalism meet and keep high festival, and the end learns to justify the means. In other words, what he's saying is, just because you have that office, okay, and you have a high office, doesn't mean you're always right. And that just because that high office historically, has this particular say about things, just because President Trump is President Trump doesn't always mean President Trump's right. Just because the pastor is the pastor doesn't mean he's always right, okay? But to be careful, the absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of what's going on here with Solomon. He's had absolute power, and absolute power has led to his downfall about things. So let's read here from 1 Kings chapter 11, starting with verse 9. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded, and therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days. Think about the mercy of God there. I'm not going to do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So the first thing here is abiding in the Lord, not just appearing. Now, think about this for just a minute. God had special reason to be displeased with Solomon. He had appeared to him twice, and Solomon still went after other gods. So think about that for just a minute. God appeared to Solomon not once, but twice. First, God appeared to Solomon at Gibeon, where the tabernacle of Moses lay rotting. 1 Kings 3:3-5 says, plainly tells us, he both walked in the statutes of his father, David, except, that big except word here, at the same time burned incense in high places. So his heart was divided even at that time. But still, God appeared to him at Gibeon. God had to fulfill his word through someone. Secondly, God appeared to Solomon when the temple was finished. So first he appeared to him at Gibeon early on when he was sacrificing there at the old tabernacle of Moses, but he's also sacrificing at high places. But then when the temple gets finished, 1 Kings 9:2 tells us, as soon as Solomon had finished the building of the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he appeared to him at Gibeon. Now, how many times has God personally appeared before you, Barbara? Has God's presence ever come right there in front of you, like a burning bush or, anything like that, and talk to you? Would that get your attention?
Absolutely.
It probably would me.
But yet, two divine visions didn't keep Solomon faithful.
No. And that's the thing that we need to understand as Christians. Sometimes we think that great spiritual experiences will keep us from sin and that keep us faithful to God. But this is not the case with the wisest man who ever lived. And it would not be the case with us also. Now think about this. The important thing here is not that God appeared to him. God wanted him to abide in him. And that's the important thing for us today, okay? We may have the greatest experience on Sunday morning in church, the smoke of the Holy Spirit be fill up that place, and, people can get healed and filled with the Spirit and all kinds of stuff go on. But if we don't keep that going being in the presence of God throughout the rest of the week, that's not good, okay? And this is what's going on with Solomon. It means that it's not the appearance of God in your life, but it's the abiding of God in your life. In the New Testament, the Apostle John tells us that God is love, and whoever abides in God abides, and God abides in him.
Yeah.
That's 1 John 4:16. Solomon didn't abide in love, he abided in his authority.
Mm-hmm.
He enslaved certain tribes and enriched himself. Solomon's kingdom was an outstanding example of wealth, military power, and prestige. Yet the true security of Israel did not rest in any of those things. It rested in the abiding presence of God and in the obedience and faithfulness of their king. Remember what God's told him. If you walk in my statutes, I will be with Israel. In other words, let's just say this. If you abide in my statutes, if you abide in my way, then I will be able to abide in Israel. Now, we got to recognize, too, the mercy of God. Sometimes we don't recognize, and I'll say Lou is guilty of not recognizing God's mercy sometimes. God was merciful to Israel for his word's sake, okay? Mm-hmm. He told Solomon that he would not divide the kingdom during his reign for the sake of Solomon's father David. God delayed this judgment until after Solomon's generation, but the disobedience that brought the judgment started in Solomon's generation, okay? This then is the historical beginning of the divided kingdom. This is the advanced part of this I want you to understand. The divided kingdom, we talked about Israel and Judah, okay? Really, it has its roots here, okay? Because God himself divides the kingdom. Think about that. Has nothing to do with Babylonian captivity or anything else. God divided the kingdom because he said, I'm going to take the tribes away, and it's going to show why here in just a minute. But God has to honor his word. And no matter how screwy it seems, God ends up honoring his word.
So this all happened at Solomon's death.
Yes, that's right. And God in his mercy says, I'm not going to do this until after you're dead and gone.
Yeah.
But what a legacy, about this. Let me see here. Many other passages in the Old Testament, such as 2 Chronicles 11:12, tells us that the southern kingdom was made up of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And several times in this chapter, the southern kingdom is referred to as one tribe. This is because either Benjamin is swallowed up in Judah, or the idea was one tribe in addition to Judah. Okay, so we're not quite sure exactly how that's worked out. But here's the important thing here, is Jeroboam. Jeroboam. because it's the abiding presence of the Lord. But he also here, God brings up and raises up an able adversary. So many times God raises the adversary up, just as he raised up the people like the Philistines and the Amorites and all the Pizerites and all those other guys to come up against Israel. Here he's raising up an adversary called Jeroboam. So Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon. Say that real quick as I identify this guy. Whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow. All those commas there, okay? Trying to identify who this cat is. A widow also lifted up his hand against the king. And this was because why he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built Milo and closed up the breach of the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. So his family is part of this forced labor, as best as we can figure out from this identification here. Jeroboam means, may the people be great. What a name. May the people be great. Maybe he was a populist leader whose family was a victim of forced labor and enemy oppression. The important point is that he was not lazy, but like an artful politician, busy behind the scenes, perhaps even instilling rebellion amongst the forced labor. Some texts call Jeroboam a mighty man of valor. This made him a more dangerous and able adversary of Solomon. But Solomon, notice this guy. Isn't it amazing how God brings people to the forefront? Sometimes he's, obscure people he brings to the forefront for somebody to notice. So there's hope for me somewhere, I guess, What ambitious people look for in their quest to climb to the top is legitimacy. In other words, credibility. They may get to the government authority to govern you, but not the moral authority. Who better to give them moral authority than a man of God? Okay? So what happens to Jeroboam, and talking about this tearing apart of the kingdom? Let's further go down there in 1 Kings 11, starting with verse 29. At that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Now think about here, I'm going to stop right there. Let's think of this. Jeroboam was in Jerusalem for something, and he was going back up north to where his people were, okay? And just by coincidence, along the way, there is a prophet of the Lord meets him, and he's in open country, which means to me is that this is not a hidden thing. This is for anybody to be able to see. They didn't do this in secret, in a building somewhere. But in open country, the prophet meets him, and he's wearing a new garment. Now, when you see new garment in the Bible, you need to start thinking people. You need to start thinking of, again, the people of God. You need to think of your life, because what? Jesus talked about you can't sew an old piece of, or a new piece of garment on an old garment. You've got to have new wine and new wineskins, okay? And also, too, you got to remember that prophets, and especially the high priest, was forbidden from tearing his clothes, okay? Even today, in some Jewish funerals, they'll still rip a pocket or something like that in certain funerals, just as a symbol of outrage, for this. But now here he is, he laid hold of a new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. Now, I don't know about you, but if Annetta got me some new clothes and I ripped them up, Annetta would not be happy with me. So this is a significant happening here.
But they didn't have a lot of money.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's right. Because, they didn't have a lot of clothes. That's right. So when he had something brand new and ripping it up is significant here. And he says to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. He rips it up into 12. He says, take 10 pieces. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So God recognizes here he's got to be true to his word. He's got to keep somebody on the throne of David because he promised it, okay? And we don't know how he's going to do it. But he says, I'm doing this for my word's sake, okay? So more authority that comes from God. Who better to legitimize your power than a priest or prophet of God? Ahijah is a prophet from Shilonite who acted out what God wanted. Ahijah takes his new garment and rips it up into 12 pieces. He does it not in secret, but in open country. He tells Jeroboam to take 10 pieces of his cloak. This means that Ahijah showed Jeroboam that he would lead 10 tribes of a divided Israel after the death of Solomon. Notice here, too, that it is a new cloak, meaning that it was not an old alliance. King David united the 12 tribes of Israel, and now just a generation later, God, or Ahijah, is ripping it apart, not done by a foreign power, but by God himself, symbolized by Ahijah. Now, think about this for just a minute, in talking about a new thing here. King David was the one that united the 12 tribes. We didn't get into all that. A couple of years ago, we studied the life of King David. But he is the one that united the 12 tribes of Israel. And so now, a generation later, meaning Solomon, it's being torn apart. They're from another great person, people you never heard of from Patterson and Austell, said it was indeed a shock for Rehoboam and the tribe of Judah to be reduced overnight from the most powerful tribe in an illustrious and world-renowned kingdom to a small state that was soon stripped of what wealth it had left. The moral authority or credibility that comes from God is not just applying the rules. If that was true, then the Israelites would have been wiped out long ago. But there are underlying principles here that need to be followed. And that was what God promised to King David, that someone from his family would always sit on the throne in Jerusalem. Second, that God had selected the Israelites, and in particular the Temple of Solomon, to carry his name. So in his mercy, he had to allow for at least one tribe to carry on the legacy that he started in Jerusalem. So in other words, now Jeroboam got authority from King Solomon to rule and be over some slave labor. So people knew him that kind of authority. Now people are seeing him now in a moral authority that now God has recognized this person's credibility, has recognized, I'm going to say his heart, but has recognized his intentions. And so he's getting both sides of this, and that's going to help him, in the long run. But at the same time, Jeroboam and later on Rehoboam, they failed. They failed too, okay? But I just wanted to see that at one point he got authority from Solomon, but also now he's getting authority from God. And he can be able to say, it's God. See that? I got this from the priest. So let's look here what happens next. 1 Kings 11:34-36. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. Talking here to Jeroboam. Yet to his son I will give 1 tribe, that my David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to put my name. God kept his promise to divide Israel and put 10 of the 12 tribes under Jeroboam as judgment for the sin and idolatry of Solomon. God kept his promise to the house of David, King David, by allowing 1 tribe to stay in the south. So this is the first we hear of the divided kingdom, which became Israel's history for hundreds of years after the death of Solomon. And this first description, we would expect that 10 tribes under Jeroboam would be larger, greater, and more enduring than the 1 tribe left under the house of David. As it worked out, just the opposite happened, because the 10 tribes forsook the Lord, while the 1 tribe was more obedient. And I'm just wondering what Jeroboam must have been thinking about all this. You know, he's not from a kingly family. He probably came up as part of the slave labor. But all of a sudden now he's thrust into leadership. And I know if somebody stopped me on the road, back home, and said, here, let me rip up my clothes here and you take 10 and take those with you, I wouldn't know what to think. But here he is. All of a sudden, God's telling him, you the boss of 10 tribes in the north. So, top of page 4 there in your notes. And I will take you and you shall reign over all that your soul desires. How would you like God to say that to you? All that your soul desires. I'd be making pars and birdies all over that golf course. And you shall be king over Israel, and I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, the king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon.
So Jeroboam reduced himself to the same tyranny as Saul did.
Yeah. Okay, and that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because again, there's some parallels here.
Yeah.
You think of Mary and Joseph and Jesus fleeing to Egypt. I don't know. I've never looked into it, but I know that there was a sizable presence of Jews in Egypt. Even you think that they would all be out of town, from when they left the captivity of Pharaoh. But I guess commerce-wise and whatever, there was a lot of money to be made in Egypt, and there was a sizable presence there. So the last point here is God's authority is no respecter of persons. Think about who Jeroboam is. Jeroboam's father is not mentioned, only his mother from the countryside away from Jerusalem. He is noticed for his productivity by the king. He is met on the road by a prophet that he has never met, and the prophet has never met him. But he follows what the prophet tells him. Can God use anyone and everyone? God can use everyone and anyone who obeys his command. Amen. God makes an amazing offer. God promised to make a lasting dynasty for Jeroboam if he would do what is right in the sight of the Lord. An obedient Jeroboam had the opportunity to establish a parallel dynasty to the house of David. And as you guys have just pointed out, the important point for us is, I will take you, not your selfish and idolatrous ego, but God. And God will give him the desires of his heart. And you shall reign over all your heart desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Just as King David wrote in Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So God ordained the division of Israel and the reign of Jeroboam. He did this as a judgment, a great judgment, upon Solomon for not following the Lord. And there are some other parallels here. Both Jeroboam and David were appointed by God to follow after disobedient kings, Saul and Solomon. David waited upon the Lord to make the throne clear, and God blessed his reign. In other words, he did not kill Saul and seized the throne when he had a chance. Jeroboam did not wait on the Lord, but made his way to the throne, and God did not bless his reign. Okay? Somewhere or another, Solomon found out about this, and he decided that he needed to kill him. Okay? But somehow or another, Jeroboam tried to take the throne. This is what some of the theologians believe. Okay? Unlike David, okay, who, in the cave, he had a chance to kill Saul, but he just cut off part of his cloak. But here, Jeroboam now runs away to Egypt. So Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. This is another startling evidence of Solomon's decline. God specifically said this would happen after the death of Solomon and in judgment of Solomon's apostasy. Solomon didn't want to hear it, so he sought to kill Jeroboam. Solomon thought he could defeat God's will in this, but he was unsuccessful. God's word through Ahijah proved true. So I'm just saying, as Annette encourages me and I try to encourage her, we got to stay in the Lord every day. It's not just him appearing to us, but we got to stay, abiding in his presence every day. And, and listen for his voice and, knowing what he wants us to do. And if you would stay in 1 Kings and read, I guess probably starting chapter 17. Next week I'll catch us up a little bit of history here about what happens to Ahijah and Shishak, the king of Egypt. But I think we're going to go ahead and start looking at Elijah and Elisha a little bit, and starting with chapter 17 or so.
On behalf of our pastor and staff here at OAG, we want to say thank you for being a part of our ministry. We are grateful for you and the support you give our church and its ministry so that we can continue to do what God has called us to do, to be the family church for the family of God. For more content from Oxford Assembly of God, check out our media website at oag.church/media.